We open and welcome to the ancestral people of this land, acknowledging that our church, like all of Burke, rests on the unceded territory of the Manahoac tribe of the Great Sioux Nation. We seek healing and the realization of justice with the people of this land who live on in their descendants, the present-day members of the Monacan Indian Nation, the Patawomic Indian Tribe of Virginia, and the Piscataway Indian Nation. We honor the ancestors as we move toward healing so that all together shall one day know full justice.
Welcome to Accotink Unitarian Universalist Church. I am Christina Watts, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm happy to be your worship associate today. I hope you got a name tag or have put your name on your Zoom name tag. If you need help with that, please let us know in the chat. If you are not new to Accotink, look around. Do you see people that you haven't met or haven't spoken to in a while? These are people like you and want to meet you. Help us live up to our mission to be a welcoming and inclusive spiritual home for all by reaching out and making a connection. By visiting this congregation, newcomers are in a transition moment, and people in transitions are likely to be open to new friendships. This means that your new best friend may be here this morning, and this is your chance to get to know them before someone else does. Whether you're a longtime member or a newcomer or something in between, we encourage you to stay for our social hour, online and in person, immediately after the service. We are so delighted that you came to join us today. Welcome.
Good morning. Good morning. This morning we celebrate the season for nonviolence, and we light our chalice with these words from Hillary Clinton. Human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are humans' rights. Let us not forget that among those rights are the right to speak freely and the right to be heard.
So this month we've been exploring justice and equity, and we've done this by first talking about what we need to dismantle. Dismantling racism and all systemic oppression is how it's phrased in our values, our new proposed values. And we really looked at how caste is the foundation for that systemic oppression here in America, based in race and racism, but existing around the world. And that getting to the core of dismantling, what we need to do is really celebrate differences, to stop seeing differences in a superior, inferior hierarchy. Then we explored together building accessible and inclusive communities, so dismantling and building. It's important to talk about what we're tearing down, but also about what we're building up. And we did that by practicing building together. That's an ongoing thing that we do together, and so we did it together collaboratively in our multi-generational service. We practiced blue sky thinking, where we really opened ourselves up to the wildest imaginations of what the world could be like, and we explored together then what it might be like to put that in practice together. Then we had examples from members of this congregation of ways that they've experienced good trouble in their lives and how that has transformed them personally and how they've been able to make transformation in the world towards justice and equity through getting in good trouble. So you had practical examples from other people of how to do that. And today we're going to talk about being diverse, multicultural, beloved community. And I think it's so important that the new proposed values say that we are called to work to be beloved community. So we're going to explore what that means, not to get there someday, but to actively embody being beloved community right here, right now, in our lives and in our community. Next month, we're going to look at transformation. So I just want to give you a little bit of sense of that. As we move towards transformation, I'm excited about next Sunday, we're going to talk about growing in spirit. For a long time, maybe since we adopted our mission statement, has that phrase that together we grow in spirit, it's occurred to me that we've never defined what we mean by that phrase, to grow in spirit. Obviously, we mean spiritual growth generally, but we're going to look at what does that mean. What does spirit mean in a Unitarian Universalist context? And how is growth different than maybe building, for example? So we're going to look at that. Then we're going to have another ensemble service where we're going to answer Rilke's question of how you live the answer to questions through your own life. We're going to have reflections on that. And then we're going to talk about, just in general, what does it mean in each moment to adapt to a changing world? I don't know if you all remember on the bookmarks, which, side note, RW, our administrator, and myself came up with those bookmarks. I made the first design and abbreviated our proposed values to shorter versions of them, and RW brought his graphic design magic and made it even better. And the UUA has asked if they can use that, disseminate that. Isn't that wonderful? So one liberty that was taken when we did that was the last phrase for transformation is that we transform the world with love. That's actually from the purposes section of the same part of our UUA bylaws. What the value says is adapt to a changing world. And I've thought since then, as beautiful and important as I think that it is to transform the world with love, adapting to a changing world is more what we do in everyday moments. You know, when you get home late and you have to throw together dinner in less time than you thought, or something breaks down in your home, or you're having a conflict with someone in your life, you have to adapt to change. You might not be transforming the whole world with love. You're just making it through the day and adapting to change. So that's what we're going to explore the third Sunday of the month. And I wanted to mention that normally we have our multi-generational service on that third Sunday, but to make space for OWL, Our Whole Lives Sexuality Education, which we're offering for 4th, 5th, and 6th graders, which is going to happen during our worship time, during the spiritual development time for children and youth, we're actually not going to have a multi-gen in the middle of the month. We won't have a multi-generational service until Easter, which falls at the end of March this particular year. Oh, but the other thing, I knew there was one other thing I wanted to tell you, which is that we will still have our meal pack on that third Sunday in March. And it's still important to the development, particularly of our children and youth, that they participate in multi-generational service and experiences together.
Good morning. Good morning. So, following our theme of community, working together to produce positive change, we wanted to share about a community that worked together in a unique way to support the civil rights movement. Georgia Gilmore was a cook at the National Lunch Company in Montgomery, Alabama. When the bus boycotts broke out in Montgomery after Rosa Parks was arrested, Georgia organized a group of women who cooked and baked to fundraise for gas and cars to help sustain the boycott. They were called the Club from Nowhere. When Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested for his role in the boycott, Georgia testified on his behalf, and her home became a meeting place for civil rights leaders. Let's read about a hidden figure of the civil rights movement who fueled the bus boycotts and demonstrated that one person can make a real change in their community and beyond. When Georgia Gilmore was a young girl, she lived on a farm in Alabama where she fed the pigs and milked the cows. Georgia did her best to listen to what her mother taught her. Think twice before doing anything you might regret, and never hate anyone. Georgia grew up and soon had a family of her own. She did plenty of cooking along the way, and when it was time for something sweet, she knew just what to do. She'd blend butter and sugar in a bowl to get her homemade pound cake started, and then add tea bags to a pot of water for a new batch of sweet tea. Georgia was a cook at the National Lunch Company in downtown Montgomery, Alabama. Because of segregation laws, the restaurant counter was separated into two sections. One side for white customers, one side for black customers. Georgia knew it was wrong, but that was the way things had always been. On December 1st, 1955, Georgia was working at the restaurant when a news alert came over the radio. A black woman named Rosa Parks had been arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger, as the law demanded. Already a civil rights activist, Rosa was tired of giving in to rules that were unjust, and she wasn't the only one. The next day, an association of black women distributed a flyer asking people to boycott public transportation on Monday. It said, "Please stay off all buses." Georgia watched as buses drove down the street, one after another, empty, empty, empty. Because she'd been treated poorly by the white drivers so many times before, Georgia hadn't ridden the buses for 2 months. Still, she wanted to be a part of the movement she saw growing. Not long after, she went to the Holt Street Baptist Church to hear Reverend Ralph Abernathy and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speak. The church was full. The crowd overflowed onto the street outside. Large speakers had been set up so thousands more could hear Dr. King. He spoke about doing good things for one another. He talked about freedom, unity, equality. We are determined here in Montgomery to work and fight until justice runs down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Those were things Georgia believed in, and she was willing to fight for them. So Georgia decided to help the best way she knew how. She worked with a group of women in her community, and together they purchased the supplies they needed: bread, lettuce, and chickens, and then off they went to work. The women brought food to the meetings that followed at the church. They sold sandwiches, and they sold dinners in their neighborhoods. As the bus boycotters walked and walked, Georgia cooked and cooked, and boy, did the people of Montgomery love her food. Georgia's group donated the profits from their sales to the Montgomery Improvement Association, which helped fund the boycott. But if anyone had found out these women were involved, they would have lost their jobs. So Georgia ran the operation, and the other women acted as secret helpers. See, the way I figured it, people always had to eat, so I made the pies, said Georgia. The women sold baked goods to stores, groceries, laundromats, and beauty shops in their neighborhoods. And people paid in cash so they wouldn't be connected to aiding the boycott. Sweet potato pie, peach pie, red velvet cake, 7-Up cake. Only Georgia knew who baked them, and only Georgia knew who bought them. Every Monday and Thursday, Georgia would go early to the boycott strategy meetings at the church. She'd walk up to the collection plate and announce how much her group was contributing. There was cheering, clapping, foot stomping. But whenever people asked where the money came from, she remembered her promise to keep it a secret. It came from nowhere, she'd say. Because of this, her brave group of women bakers became known as the Club from Nowhere. The club not only raised enough to purchase gas for the carpool system that had been set up for the boycott, but they were also able to buy station wagons to aid the effort and help get people where they needed to go. But Montgomery didn't want their buses continuing to lose money, so the city did what it could to stop the protesters in their efforts. Dr. King and 89 others were arrested for their roles in the boycott. And Georgia was called to speak in court about an instance when a bus driver had mistreated her. After she had already paid, the driver demanded she get off and enter through the back of the bus, as black riders were forced to do at the time. When I reached the back door and was about to get on, he shut the back door and pulled off, and I didn't even ride the bus after paying my fare. So I decided right then and there I wasn't going to ride the buses anymore, Georgia testified. Georgia knew she was doing the right thing by standing up for her fellow protesters, but news of the trial spread across the country like wildfire. When the National Lunch Company found out she was part of the boycott, she was fired from her job. Georgia was unemployed and raising 6 children on her own. She needed to find a new way to support her family. Dr. King encouraged her to start her own business. All these years you've worked for somebody else. Now it's time you worked for yourself, he said. He helped her improve the kitchen in her home, and Georgia got new pots and pans and cooking supplies. Word soon got around and people came to eat at Georgia's. When they came to her house for a meal, they would eat wherever they could find a seat. And if they couldn't find a seat, they'd eat standing up. Georgia loved to talk and joke with her customers and friends. Soon enough, there were long lines to get a meal cooked by her. People ordered meals for delivery too. Georgia was making hundreds of lunches each day. She packed up fried chicken, black-eyed peas with okra, fresh corn muffins, and apple pie, and sent her kids out to deliver them. If you were lucky, you might even get homemade mac and cheese. She was providing good food for her community, but she was also bringing the people of Montgomery together, black and white. Dr. King frequently had meals at Georgia's house because she was a big woman with a big personality. He lovingly called her Tiny. And because civil rights leaders knew they could trust Georgia, her home became a place for important and often secret meetings. I just served them and let them talk, she'd say. On November 13th, 1956, Georgia was cooking in her kitchen, listening to music on the radio when the station interrupted the song to deliver the news. The Supreme Court had declared that segregation on buses was illegal. The boycotters had won. Georgia was thrilled. People could ride the bus and sit anywhere they desired. At the next church meeting, Georgia sat in her seat and listened as Dr. King announced that the Montgomery bus boycott was a success. "We didn't have to walk no more," said Georgia. Even before Martin Luther King Jr. got up there and told us it was over. We knew it was over, and we knew we had won. Still, there would be more battles to fight, so Georgia Gilmore kept right on cooking. Well, I don't know about y'all, but I feel both incredibly inspired by Georgia's story and incredibly hungry for lunch too. So in our spiritual development class today, we're going to focus on practical and unique ways that we each can give to our community and advocate for change. Thank you so much.
Well, if that isn't a story of embodying beloved community, I don't know what is. Justice can taste sweet, like pie. Do we have anything coming up featuring pies? Wow. We do, don't we? True Accotink Colors is hosting, you might remember they did this in the fall, they're hosting a pie off on March 10th, a few days before Pie Day. Get it? Pie Day? That's March 14th. And we're going to have a potluck as well. So you can bake some pies, you can bake some macaroni and cheese, you can make whatever you want and bring it to church on March 10th as a way of embodying beloved community together.
The reading today is an excerpt from Walking with Our Ancestors by Barbara A. Holmes. The civil rights marches of the 1960s were contemplative, sometimes silent, sometimes drenched with song, but always contemplative. This may mean, within the context of a desperate quest for justice, that while weary feet traversed well-worn streets, hearts leaped into the lap of God. You cannot face German shepherds and fire hoses with your own resources. There must be God and stillness at the very center of your being. The sacred act of walking together towards justice was usually preceded by a pre-march meeting that began with a prayer service, where preaching, singing, and exhortation prepared the people to move toward the hope they all held. Like a spiritual earthquake, The resolve of marchers affirmed the faith of foremothers and forefathers. Each marcher embodied the communal affirmation of already/not yet sacred space. Ronald Grimes describes ritual processionals that bear many of the markers of civil rights marches. He says, "A procession is the linearly ordered, solemn movement of a group through chartered space to a known destination, to give witness, to bear an esteemed object, to perform a rite, fulfill a vow, gain merit, visit a shrine." Applying Grimes's elements to civil rights marches, I find the spiritual destination was the consciousness of the nation. The witness was that nonviolence was the most powerful weapon within human control. The esteemed object was the sacred imago Dei in dark bodies. The rite was the act of walking in community to challenge the forces of evil and death. The vow was the unspoken commitment to redeem the sacrifices of the ancestors. The shrine was within. The merit was God's favor extended to people of faith and obedience. These contemplative acts moved the community forward toward the fulfillment of one small aspect of beloved community, the end of legally sanctioned segregation.
So I want to start this morning by lifting up just a few things from the wisdom you just heard from Barbara Holmes. Number one, that the activism of the civil rights movement of the 1960s was rooted in contemplation and the commitment to nonviolence. For this reason, preparation for direct action often included engaging in spiritual practices before the action, such as communal singing and prayer. I also want to point out, it might have been hard to notice just listening to that once, but she really highlights that the march as a form of activism was uniquely appropriate for the goals of the civil rights movement. Because in that act of marching, it demonstrated the dignity of Black people as a counter to the dehumanization of Black people in order to transform the conscience of the nation. So when she talks about imago Dei, that means the image of God in dark bodies. She's saying that that act of marching served to lift up dignity. And she concludes by saying that the civil rights movement succeeded in fulfilling one aspect of beloved community: the end of legally sanctioned segregation. Now, I would call that a grand achievement, but Holmes calls it the fulfillment of one small aspect of beloved community. I believe she also sees it as a grand achievement, but calls it small because there is still so much work to be done. She speaks of marchers embodying the space of already not yet, the sacred space of already not yet. Now, this may be unfamiliar language to many of us as Unitarian Universalists. It's a reference to Jesus' defiance of the imperial structures of domination and dehumanization on the cross, and the resurrection of divine love that cannot be destroyed because it lives in the heart of a community committed to liberation. And the transformation of the Messiah is meant to bring about a world transformed, meant to bring about heaven on earth in its Christian conception. And obviously, we don't have that heaven on earth. And so Christians speak of that transformation being already and not yet fulfilled. So what is it like to embody that sacred space of already not yet? Holmes suggests that this embodiment comes from engaging in contemplative practice, like we did when we sang Ubi Caritas together. That to be the beloved community the beloved community that both already exists and doesn't yet exist, we need to root ourselves in contemplative practice. The genesis of the great justice movements of the 20th century, she writes, emerged from the consistent contemplative practices of those seeking liberation. Contemplation, she continues, plugs the supplicants into the catalytic center of God's Spirit, into the divine power that permeates every aspect of life. Now, we as Unitarian Universalists may or may not feel comfortable with that language of God's Spirit, so you can substitute love or the Spirit of love if you need to. Speaking of Fannie Lou Hamer, Holmes compared the civil rights movement to a monastic space. Fannie Lou Hamer, she writes, was cloistered in an activist movement, finding her focus, restoration, and life in God in the midst of beloved community already here and yet coming. I feel that is essential wisdom for us about how to embody beloved community. That we can't do the work of dismantling oppression and building accessible and inclusive communities unless we have this experience of being cloistered in the midst of beloved community that is already here and yet coming. In the fancy theological speak of the academic study of religion, this is called a radically realized eschatology. Radically realized eschatology is a critique or perhaps a clarification of what's known as social gospel Christianity. And Unitarian Universalist, while not a Christian faith, you can be Christian and Unitarian Universalist, just as you can be Jewish or Buddhist or Muslim and Unitarian Universalist. And Unitarian Universalism itself comes out of Christianity. But as a faith tradition, we're no longer Christian. I was going to say limited to Christianity. And I mean that in the literal sense, not the pejorative sense. Unitarian Universalism is, however, firmly rooted in the movement known as social gospel Christianity, which means that the application of the gospel goes beyond individual salvation to include also the transformation of oppressive social structures. This was a big part of the success and the mode of operation of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, this social gospel Christianity. But the risk in the social gospel movement, as former Star King, that's the seminary I went to, Unitarian Universalist Seminary, former Star King president and theologian Rebecca Ann Parker has pointed out, the risk in the social gospel movement is that it can feel Sisyphean, right? It can feel like we're pushing a heavy rock up a huge mountain for eternity while never ever reaching the top of the mountain. We're always trying to get to that place where we've transformed the world, but never experiencing the awesome view of the promised land from the summit of the mountain. This is what radically realized eschatology is trying to address. It's trying to say already and not yet. It's pointing us towards the experience of beloved community, of heaven on earth, in the process of doing the work. That's why I feel it's so important that our new proposed UU values say that we work to be diverse, multicultural, beloved community. Not build, but be beloved community. The book, Liberating Church, a collection of essays from multiple contributors, lays out the marks of a liberating church, or communities that are being beloved community actively. And they draw these 8 marks from the hush harbors that sustained enslaved African communities during the period of chattel slavery in the United States. Hush harbors were the clandestine meetings where enslaved Africans would go at night and practice a religion of liberation in order to survive and thrive despite their imprisonment and brutalization in forced labor camps. Imprisonment and brutalization in forced labor camps that I think we should not forget spanned generations. So one of these markers the writers of Liberating Church call joy unspeakable, which is a phrase taken from the very same Barbara Holmes that we heard in our reading and that I quoted earlier in the sermon. This is that contemplative practice that connects us to a deep wellspring of love, a deep wellspring of love that dwells in the center of our being, a love that also comes to life through relationship, that comes to life in the spaces between us. And this contemplative practice centers us in joy, in connection, in compassion and care, in peace, and in rest in the midst of the struggle. Now, the authors also speak of creating a countercultural community where we learn and grow together, sustaining each other on the journey. And they're inspired in this vision by how enslaved Africans would steal away to these hush harbors, where they would stay woke throughout the night while their enslavers slept, unaware, asleep to the revolution of liberation happening right under their noses. So these contemporary theologians of the liberating church movement use this imagery of stealing away as a marker for how we need to step outside of the structures and assumptions of our society, a society that still structurally supports oppression, so that we can practice taking on the view of the marginalized, so that we can find inspiration in the wisdom that comes from surviving and thriving in opposition to oppressive structures. They use the image of staying woke as a marker for how we need to be engaged in continual learning and unlearning. We are steeped in structures and the structures and habits and minds of our society. Even when we don't explicitly sign on to these beliefs, they permeate our consciousness, often directing our actions despite our best intentions. I've used before the example of how I'm a committed feminist, but this commitment doesn't change the fact that I've been socialized as a man in a still very sexist society. This means that I enact sexism quite often, despite the fact that I don't want to. It means that it takes study and work to retrain myself in different ways of being that are not sexist in order to fulfill my commitment. It means I need to actively stay woke, to wake up to the ways that I'm still living out those structures and wake up to new ways of being. So all of these things, this contemplative practice, we do this together in community with each other. We imagine these alternative ways of being in community with each other. We engage in the work of spiritual growth, countering false teachings and practicing new ways of being in community with each other. And that brings us to two other of the markers that these contemporary theologians of the liberating church movement place at the foundation of how to be beloved community together. One they call All God's Children Got Shoes, after the song. And what they mean by that, I waited actually to write the last part of this sermon until I got this book in the mail late this week. And I'm glad that I did, and also in some ways I didn't need to, because what they mean is what we mean when we talk about the value of equity, about our commitment to honoring that every person is worthy of dignity and of flourishing with dignity. And also what we mean in our value of pluralism, that we're going to celebrate every person as a sacred being and celebrate the special spiritual gifts. And I say spiritual gifts, accounting is a spiritual gift. Putting up these chairs is a spiritual gift. Baking pies is a spiritual gift. I don't mean spiritual gift to be some otherworldly thing, right? It's the everyday actions we take together. And each of us has different gifts to bring. And as we discussed when we discussed dismantling oppressive systems, our differences, when they're brought together, can also spark new creative possibilities, new gifts that we didn't even know we had, that come out of that creative space of celebrating and sharing our differences. And so we celebrate each other and we care for each other, and we make what's called leaderful communities, where we're welcoming each other into leadership, honoring the gifts that each of us bring. And we do this both within these walls as we care in community, as our mission statement says, within these walls as we grow together in spirit, as our mission statement says, and beyond these walls through our work in service and acting for justice, as our mission statement says. And all of this is rooted in Ubuntu, which comes from a Zulu phrase that means a person is a person through other people. They point out, as I too have named in past sermons, that interdependency and collectivism are largely discouraged and disincentivized in most American and Western contexts. This is another script that we might not buy into explicitly, but which drives us. I don't know how many people I've talked to in this congregation who struggle to reach out for help and support because the message that we're supposed to be self-sufficient and independent and not need each other is so strong. In contrast, as the authors tell us, we must know and believe that our well-being is tied up with the well-being of the people in closest proximity to us and to all those that are oppressed. They continue writing that we are only as strong as our most vulnerable neighbor, our elderly neighbor, our trans neighbor, our incarcerated neighbor. Because of this interdependence, this practice of Ubuntu, this coming together in relationships of mutuality, we show up for each other. We feed one another, they say. We love on our kids, they say. We create and maintain sharing circles, they say. This is what community should look like. And this is, in many ways, what our community looks like. This is what being beloved community is like. Stealing away, studying together, learning together, practicing together, caring for each other in practical ways, with food and with a listening ear, like we heard about in the hymn, When Our Heart is in a Holy Place. When we do these things, we are already at the summit of the mountain. We're already seeing the promised land. As the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. reminds us, a positive religious faith does not offer an illusion that we shall be exempt from pain and suffering. Nor does it imbue us with the idea that life is a drama of unalloyed comfort and untroubled ease. Rather, it instills us with the inner equilibrium needed to face strains, burdens, and fears that inevitably come, and assures us that the universe is trustworthy and God is concerned. So let's take this wisdom about being beloved community. And what I think it boils down to put it in slightly different words, we can say beloved community, or we can just say community, 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 community. What does it look like to make the highest priority in any interaction, make the highest priority connection and care? We have some gatherings that are just focused on that, just about connecting. But even when we're doing work together, even when we're doing the meal packs, when we're having committee meetings, even in those moments, what does it look like if we make sure that our highest priority in those interactions is connection and care, I think it makes those meetings more fun, more joyful, more connected, more nourishing for us, so that we are built up, lifted up in the process of doing the work by embodying beloved community in every moment of our lives. We're getting our spirit fed while we're doing the work. I think that's important. So I hope we're doing that here. I know we're doing that here, but I say I hope we're doing that here because of the next advice I'm going to give you, which is that if you are doing justice work and it isn't nourishing you, it isn't nourishing your whole self, it isn't nourishing your soul and your spirit and your heart and your mind, you can't stop doing the work, but you might want to start doing it with a different community, right? Put your work in where your whole self is fed and nourished, in places where beloved community is being embodied, so that the work fires you up, so that the work brings you peace and joy and a sense of flourishing, so that you feel your imago Dei, your divine sacredness, your best self coming to life. May it be so, and may we be among those who embody beloved community, so that we experience the promised land all the way that we're on the journey, so that we experience that centering spirit of love. As we practice love, that we feel that spirit of love. We feel that spirit of love filling the earth.
Please rise now in body or in spirit and join us in our closing words. As we extinguish our chalice, I invite you to join me now in our community blessing with these words of David Bumbaugh. This church is dedicated to the proposition that behind all our differences and beneath our diversity, there is a unity that makes us one and binds us forever together in spite of time, death, and the space between the stars. We pause now in silent witness to that unity. Now that we've gathered together in this welcoming and inclusive spiritual home, let us go out to the world nourished, rejuvenated, and inspired to share our values.